Welcome to the Way Forward Regenerative Conversation Podcast number 38, Mobilizing the Green Vote, a conversation with Nathaniel Stinnett. I'm Jim Burke, the producer. Today we have another compelling episode. It is a groundbreaking discussion with Nathaniel Stinnett, founder of the Environmental Voter Project, whose mission is more critical than ever. With millions of environmentalists failing to vote in past elections, Nathaniel is on a mission to turn this silent majority into a powerful force that politicians cannot ignore. Join us as we explore the untapped potential of environmental voters and how mobilizing them can reshape the political landscape and drive significant environmental progress. In this episode, we sit down with Nathaniel Stinnett, the visionary behind Environmental Project. Nathaniel delves into the critical importance of mobilizing non-voting environmentalists for the 2024 presidential election. He explains the innovative strategies his organization uses to turn environmental concern into actionable voting power, emphasizing the transformative potential of these voters. Nathaniel discusses the demographics of non-voting environmentalists, the challenges of voter suppression, and the behavioral science techniques that effectively increase voter turnout. The conversation sheds light on the urgent need to engage environmentally conscious citizens in the democratic process to ensure their voices shape future policies. Nathaniel, besides being founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project, has over a decade of experience as a senior advisor, consultant, and trainer for political campaigns and advocacy nonprofits. Nathaniel is a recognized leader in political strategy, dubbed the voting guru by Grist magazine, and hailed as a visionary by the New York Times. He frequently speaks on innovative campaign techniques and voter behavior. Nathaniel has held senior positions in numerous political campaigns and serves on the board of advisors for MIT's Environmental Solutions Initiative. He holds a BA from Yale University and a JD from Boston College Law School and resides in Boston with his wife and 2 children. We extend our deepest gratitude to our sponsors, the Elders Action Network and Elders Climate Action, for their unwavering support. Their commitment to empowering elders to take meaningful action on climate issues is instrumental in driving the change we seek. And now for our hosts, Dr. John Izu and Alain Gauthier.
Hi, I'm Dr. John Izzo, and on behalf of my co-host, Alain Gauthier, I want to welcome you to this episode of the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast, where we explore ideas and issues about the way forward for humanity and planet, especially from the perspective of those over 50 and the role that we can play in creating the kind of future we want for ourselves and for the planet. Welcome. It's great to have you here today, whatever age you are. So Alain, first of all, welcome back from France. It's nice to have you back from your homeland. We missed you.
I missed you too.
And I'm really excited about today's topic because it's so timely. There's so much going on right now in the United States around elections. This is a big election year wherever you stand on various issues. And a couple of things occur to me as we come into this episode today, which really is about getting people out to vote, especially around environmental issues. And it's not a surprise to any of our listeners and subscribers that we have a very strong environmental bent here. I've kind of been, I guess, some version of an environmentalist since I was 16 years old, growing up in New York City, trying to protect the green belt in Staten Island. I don't even know why. I spent almost no time in nature. I think for me, I became an environmentalist because of my religious upbringing. And I really was taught that everything was sacred, both nature and humanity. So you ought to preserve it. You ought to make it better. But this issue of voting, in the last presidential election 3.5 years ago, about 1 out of every 3 Americans who could vote didn't vote. Now think about that for a minute. 1 out of 3 people who could have weighed in on their own future and the future of their children chose not to. And there's lots of complex reasons for that. And I'm hoping with our guest today, we're going to get to talk about that. Why is it that so many people don't vote? We know people personally and why they do that, but why? But the other thing that, as an environmentalist, has plagued me is the small role that the environment has seemed to play in elections, especially in the United States. I think in Europe and in Canada, where I spend some of my time, in addition to the States, I feel it's played a much bigger role, for example, in Canadian and European politics, environment and climate change in particular, in terms of who people vote for and how they hold their leaders accountable. But in the United States, in the last presidential elections, really going back the last 5 or 6, there's usually one very vague question about climate change, which usually isn't answered very deeply by either candidate, except for Al Gore. And so why does the environment seem to play so little a role in spite of the deep concern that people have about the issue? So I'm really excited to get into it with our guest today, who I think is really going to help us understand that and explore what we can do about it.
And so am I, John. As you said, I just spent a month in France, and the elections were very much dominated by some of the environmental issues. That are probably why the left ended up being more present in people's vote than the right, which is not open to the environment. So let's see. I'm very curious too.
So Nathaniel Stinnett, welcome into the Way Forward podcast studio. We're excited to have you today.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you, Ella. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
So let's start at the 30,000 foot level and tell us, Nathaniel, about your personal journey, not kind of every aspect of your life, but your personal journey, and especially how it led you to start the Environmental Voter Project. What was the fire, if you will, that caused you to start that organization?
Yeah, so I come from the world of politics, so not from the world of environmental policy making. And I live in Boston and had run political campaigns, big and small, here for decades. And I was always deeply frustrated by how few voters prioritized climate and environmental issues. No matter how good the candidate I was working for was on climate and the environment, boy, is it hard to justify running a campaign on an issue that voters don't really care that much about. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't think there was much we could do to solve that problem. And it was only by chance, after running a mayoral campaign, now almost 10 years ago, that I was looking over some polling data with a friend of mine, and I saw something that totally blew my mind. And that was that although there weren't many voters who listed climate as a top priority, when we looked at non-voters, there were many, many more of them who did. And when I saw that, I started looking at more and more polling data and started seeing the same thing. And all of a sudden it occurred to me, what if the climate movement doesn't have a persuasion problem as much as we have a turnout problem? And that started a long process, at the end of which I ended up starting a brand new nonprofit called the Environmental Voter Project that doesn't try to convince people to care more about the climate. Instead, we find people who already care about climate yet aren't voting, and we mobilize them to vote. And that might seem like a very narrow niche, but as I'm sure we're going to get into during our discussion, it's not as small a niche as you might like to imagine. There are lots of these non-voting environmentalists out there.
That first fact kind of blows my mind. And because I think most of us tend to think of it, people who are concerned about the environment, as generally engaged citizens. So it begs a really interesting question. Who are these citizens? So as you digged deeper and found out, and I would have had that same reaction that you did. So good for you, good for the world that you discovered that. Dig a little deeper. Who are these people who don't vote, and what are the reasons? The various reasons why they don't vote. So who are they demographically, and what did you discover about why they are not engaged in the electoral process?
Great question. So first, let's just put a number on this. If we look at the last presidential election, so the 2020 presidential election, we estimate that 8 million registered voters who list climate as a top priority stayed home and didn't vote. 8 million. in an election that was decided by 44,000 votes in 3 states. So this is a big, big population. Now you ask, who are they? Well, they are found in all demographic groups, but there are some trends. First, they are disproportionately young. Second, they are disproportionately people of color. Third, they are disproportionately lower income. So you actually asked, maybe you didn't realize they were connected, but you asked 2 connected questions here, John. Who are these people and why aren't they voting? Well, one of the reasons they're not voting has to do with who they are. Because when you look at people who are disproportionately young, people of color and lower income, well, they all vote less often. And that's partially because young people and people of color are almost always the target of voter suppression efforts. And so I don't want to imply that people are out there trying to make it harder for environmentalists to vote. No, I don't think that's what's going on. They're trying to make it harder for young people and people of color to vote. And that just happens to be the beating heart of the modern environmental movement. So that's one of the things that's going on here. The second reason why these people aren't voting is we've come to see in a lot of polling data that when people think about environmental action or action on climate, they often think of personal behavioral choices, like eating less meat or biking to work or consuming clean electricity or things like that. Whereas you would never hear someone who's concerned about healthcare or mass shootings think that way, right? Like they automatically view their problem as a systemic political problem that requires systemic political solutions. But we haven't internalized that yet in the climate movement. And we often don't view addressing the climate crisis as a political opportunity. We see it as sort of a personal behavioral choice. And we need to get beyond that.
It kind of reminds me of a plastics executive saying he loved recycling because recycling meant people weren't thinking about should we be using plastic at all. So that's kind of what you're getting at, isn't it?
That's exactly right, John. I mean, there has been a very sophisticated PR campaign from the fossil fuel industry for decades that has been focused on just that thing. They've essentially been telling us, like, don't pay attention to that coal-fired power plant back there. Instead, it's all your fault, John, for having a plastic water bottle in your hand. And we kind of bought it. We bought it hook, line, and sinker. And this is how we view addressing the climate crisis, which is exactly what the fossil fuel industry wants us to think. They want us to think that we are the guilty ones, and the only solution is to change our personal behavior, and we should keep our hands off their profits and their power plants, which is absurd.
Now, one fact which is interesting to me, we know that Americans' attitude toward climate change has changed somewhat since 2017, when 72% believed climate change was happening, and today 78%. But the percentage who believe it is human caused has stayed the same at about 53%. So what do you make of this disconnect, and how do we overcome that with voters?
Well, so those are 2, I think, really interesting parts of that question, Ella. First, what do I make of the disconnect? I think it means that it's really, really hard to change people's minds. We live at a moment in time where it's become almost impossible to change people's opinions, but especially about climate change. Especially about climate change. Now, to get to the second part of your question, what can we do to overcome that? Well, I don't want to claim that we shouldn't try, but I do want to suggest that changing a whole bunch of people's minds isn't the only way to build the power of the climate movement. In fact, our approach at the Environmental Voter Project is, boy, it's really hard to change people's opinions and minds. So let's not do that. Let's find the people whose opinions don't need to be changed. Let's find the people who you shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change. Like it's already the most important thing in their lives, yet they're not taking this really important action, which is voting.
Yeah.
And let's try to change their behavior. And I won't claim that behavior change is easy. Of course, it's not easy. But usually it's easier than changing people's minds. And I'd like to suggest to you and your listeners that trying to get everybody to agree with us is often an impossible goal. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. We should always be trying. But sometimes it's more efficient to not try to change everybody's minds and instead find the people who are already with us and make sure that they're doing the most impactful things that they can do. And often that means taking political action.
Yeah, one of the interesting things is just depending on, if you're an environmentalist or environmental oriented and you want to get different leaders in our nation and around the world, that 1/3 who don't vote is actually an opportunity, not just a challenge, right? Because if everyone voted, like one of our previous guests said, we should have compulsory voting like Australia does. And I thought about it, thought I really wouldn't favor it. First of all, I think in a free society, people should have the right to not decide about their future, right? That it's a human right to not, you don't have to vote. To me, that I wouldn't want people to be required to vote. Plus, it means that people who are not engaged at all will vote and then can be manipulated much more easily. But let's talk for a moment about this important point you made. The New York Times a few months ago now ran an article basically saying in America now, elections pretty much are determined by who turns out to vote, really reinforcing your point that all this stuff about helping people in the middle decide, this is marginal. This is really about getting out people to vote. So let's get to the core of it now. How does EVP go about its work? And how do you use the science of voting behavior? And then tell us some of maybe your greatest successes as well as some of the things you've learned that don't work to do this. So now let's dig into the weeds of what you guys do. And I'm especially interested in this kind of science of voting.
Yeah, so it's a 3-step process. So we need to identify these non-voting environmentalists, we need to get them to vote, and then we need to turn them into habitual voters. So the first step, identifying them. We obviously can't interview every single American to find out like all the people who list climate as a top priority. But what we can do is we can poll huge numbers of people, isolate the ones who say climate's their number one priority, and then build highly accurate models to find other people who are like them. So that's the approach that we take. Second, once we've identified these super environmentalists, it's pretty easy to then figure out which ones are likely to vote and which ones aren't. And this is maybe the single most important aspect of politics that perhaps maybe many of your listeners don't know. Whether you vote or not is public record. It's public record. Who you vote for is secret. But in the United States, whether you vote or not, that's public record. So once we identify these super environmentalists, it's then pretty easy to figure out which ones of them are likely to vote and which ones aren't. Okay, so we found these non-voting environmentalists. Step 2, how do we get them to vote? Well, behavioral science tells us if you're trying to get someone to change their behavior, usually what doesn't work is to try to rationally convince them of the value of doing something. Like, I know we're not supposed to say this, but we all know that, like, there's a pretty small likelihood of our one vote ever determining the outcome of an election, right? And so if you extrapolate from that, you probably shouldn't try to convince someone to vote by getting them to focus on the value of that one vote. Instead, what behavioral science tells us is we should view people as social animals rather than rational animals. And so we try to figure out how are they trying to fit into societal norms? And we use messaging that relies on that. So let me give you an example or two. We will use FOMO, fear of missing out. And we'll call up environmentalists and we'll say, oh, more and more of your peers are voting each year. Don't be left behind. Or we'll call them and we'll say, hey, Alain, did you know that last year 137 people on your block of Main Street turned out to vote? Just basic peer pressure. We will even knock on people's doors, ask if they intend to vote. Most people will be embarrassed and they'll say yes. And then we'll follow up with them right before the election and equate the act of voting with whether they're an honest person who keeps their promises or not. These are little social nudges that often have nothing to do with climate change or the environment, but they can dramatically increase turnout among these non-voting environmentalists. So these are the techniques that we use.
So one of the interesting things we found in researching the work of EEVP is that you focus not just on getting people to vote in one election, but to make them consistent voters over time. So can we talk about that?
Exactly. I mean, you don't need to be a behavioral scientist to just intuitively understand that it's really hard to change someone's habits if you only talk to them once every 2 years when there's a big federal election going on. That would be like getting in shape by going to the gym once every 2 years, right? Like that's not how you change people's habits. And so what we do is whenever there is an election in one of our 19 states, even if it's for something that has nothing to do with climate policy making, it could be a library trustee election, it could be a dog catcher election, but we will still use that election as an opportunity to talk to these low propensity voters to get them into the habit of voting. And that's crucially important for two reasons. One, voting is a potentially habitual behavior, just like eating healthy or exercising. But two, remember what I said earlier about public voter records. Whether you vote or not is public record. And so let's say we get a low propensity climate voter to vote for the first time in some city council or dog catcher race. Well, that almost immediately becomes public record. And then everybody who's running for anything races to start talking to that environmentalist because they can now see that they're now a voter. They're now a first-class citizen. And all of a sudden, now these environmentalists are driving policymaking. Let me get to the third and final reason why this is important. Not only is this the best way to then create habitual climate voters, but it also means that you're not just impacting policymaking on the federal level, you're also doing it at the state and local level. And as I'm sure you know, and many of your listeners know, climate policy isn't just made by presidents and senators. It's made by city councilors and mayors and state legislators. And all of these politicians are interested in winning elections. And so, yeah, if climate voters show up for a city council race, you better believe city councilors are going to start being better climate leaders. That's what we're going for.
So lots of things popped for me. Maybe let's go to the local piece for just a moment. Isn't it true, Nathaniel, that in my mind, some of the most interesting things that are happening around environment are happening at the local and the state level? Isn't that true? So people shouldn't think this is just about who I vote for president or the senator. Like there are a lot of interesting things happening at the local level that when they are added together, aggregately having a big impact.
Absolutely. Let's say you want to, in your personal life, ride your bike to work more often or take public transit. Well, who's going to decide whether there are protected bike lanes or good public transit in your neighborhood? That ain't the president. That's your mayor. That's your state legislature. Or let's decide you want to change the mix of electricity that you consume. Well, that is a state-regulated monopoly, your utility. Let's decide that you want your home to be more energy efficient. Well, these are state and often local building codes and zoning codes. But I got to tell you something. Your city councilors and your mayors and your state legislators, they're going to care about potholes in public schools if the only people who show up to elect them are people who care about potholes in public schools. But if climate voters start showing up, if climate voters show up in these local and state races, you better believe that leaders will follow, because nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. They're going to go where the voters tell them to go, not out of the goodness of their hearts, but because they really like winning elections. And so that's why it's so important for us to exercise our political power up and down the ballot.
Yeah. And it's not just about, by the way, you motivated me, Nathaniel, because in the community that I live in, there's a lot of growth going on and we have a lot of forests still intact. And the city is just as a new urban forestation plan that I think is pretty mediocre in terms of like balancing. And there's like a public meeting tomorrow. And I was saying, maybe I'll go, maybe I won't. And you reminded me who's going to go. All the like developer people are going to go and say, damn the trees. So I'm going tomorrow. And it kind of gets to an important piece too, that it isn't just about electing people. Don't we have to be more engaged in citizens between elections? A number of years ago, I was at the former premier of British Columbia. I live in California and in British Columbia, so I get to rant about two and vote in two countries. But anyway, and no, for those who think I'm voting twice, no, I'm allowed to vote in both countries. But anyway, the former premier of British Columbia, Gordon Campbell, who really was one of the leaders around climate change, even though it comes from a more conservative movement. But Gordon Campbell, when he was running for premier, said in a small event of business leaders that I was at, he asked the rhetorical question, why do politicians break their promises once they're elected? And then he answered his own question. He said, it's because you let us. It's because in between elections, you're not engaged. If you care about something and we promised it, you need to be all over us, right? You need to be calling us, coming and meeting with us. So do you guys doing anything in between elections to keep voters? Bernie Sanders said we need a new American revolution, by which he meant the voters being engaged, not just during elections.
So it's a great point. We do not do advocacy in between elections. There are a lot of great organizations that do that, and we don't feel like there needs to be another one. I do want to stress, though, that politicians know whether you vote or not. And if that sounds creepy, well, then good. You're understanding what the point I'm trying to get across. People underestimate how important this aspect of the public voter file is. But just imagine you're running for office and you literally have, by name and street address, a list of all the people who typically vote in the election you're trying to win. Well, who do you think you're going to end up talking to with your limited time and money on your campaign? Yeah, the voters. And who do you think you're going to poll to figure out which issues to prioritize? The voters. And the non-voters, well, they're going to get ignored. And I know that sounds cynical, but guys, politicians want to win elections. And so you're absolutely right that you need to keep up the pressure in between elections. But let's be really clear. Even in between elections, politicians know two things. They know who votes, because they literally have them on lists, and they know who donates. And why are donors important? Because they help politicians reach voters and win elections. It always comes down to the brutal arithmetic of democracy, which is you either go where the votes are or you don't get to be a politician anymore. So we really need to flex our political muscles in the climate movement, year in, year out, federal, state, local, and yes, even between elections.
Yeah, really important. And by the way, not holding your feet to the fire. One organization shouldn't have to do everything, so that's not your lane.
No, but it's a very important question.
So you guys are in 19 states. Why those 19 states? And I have to admit, I don't have the map in front of me, but we have a presidential election coming up, and it occurred to me a lot of those battleground states are not in those 19 states. I'm just curious how that's not a slam. I'm just curious why those particular 19 states. And if you have one really good success story, Nathaniel, like an election or a place where you'd point to, well, we really could see that we made a difference. Anyway, talk about those two issues.
Yeah, so we are in 19 states, and people can go to environmentalvoter.org to see the map of the states that we are in, because those are the states where we've identified the largest numbers of non-voting environmentalists. It doesn't really matter how good we are if we're only turning 20 non-voters into super voters in a state. Now, it just so happens that when you look at those 19 states, we are in almost all of the big battleground states. So we are in Pennsylvania and Arizona and Nevada and North Carolina and Georgia. We are not in Michigan and Wisconsin, but that's because there aren't that many non-voting environmentalists in Michigan and Wisconsin. And so I wouldn't claim that those states are unimportant. I would claim that if you care about those two states, you should be supporting another group. We want to work where we can have the most impact. And in states like Arizona, Pennsylvania, oh my gosh, can we make an enormous difference? Now, you ask about an example. We've got a whole bunch of examples, but the one that I would like to bring up is in Georgia. Maybe you and many of your listeners remember in 2020, it actually bled over into 2021 when there were those 2 U.S. Senate runoffs in Georgia that were going to decide control of the U.S. Senate. Well, over $1 billion was spent in Georgia over those 2 months. The little old environmental voter project only spent about 500,000. Still not a small amount, but nothing compared to $1 billion. What we saw in voter files after that election was that in our randomized control trials, this is how we run experiments to measure our impact, we were able to prove that we were solely responsible for increasing turnout among these low propensity climate voters by 0.9 percentage points, so almost 1%. Now, that might not sound like a lot to you, but in politics, like 1% is everything. It is everything. And this was in the midst of $1 billion being spent. We could still prove that we were solely responsible for increasing turnout among the almost 400,000 people we were targeting by 1%. That means we were solely responsible for getting 4,000 voters to the polls who otherwise wouldn't have voted. Now, the margin was bigger than 4,000. I'm not going to claim that the Environmental Voter Project won or lost that election, but that is how powerful this approach is. But there's a coda to this story. And that is, after that election, the whole world forgot about Georgia. It was like you could hear this huge sucking sound as like everybody left and flew back to Washington, D.C. But not us. We got right back to work mobilizing low propensity environmental voters because 3 weeks later, there was going to be a special district attorney race in a teeny little county in rural Georgia. And this is what I mean by the Environmental Voter Project paying attention to making habitual voters. I would not claim that that little district attorney race had anything to do with climate policymaking. It didn't. But you better believe that I am super proud, not just of the fact that we were able to dramatically increase turnout in those really important U.S. Senate runoffs, but also that when everybody left, we were the only group that went right back to work and made sure that these low propensity voters were even voting in this dinky little off-cycle special district attorney race. Because that ultimately is how you build a sustainable block of unstoppable climate voters.
You mentioned at the beginning that the US situation is maybe quite different from many other democracies. However, I was wondering, when you created EVP, did you look around in other countries what already existed that was pointing in the same direction? And what did you learn?
It's a great question, Ella. We did look around. First, we looked in the United States. We wanted to make sure, like, is there any other group doing this? And, we didn't find anybody doing it. And then we looked elsewhere, and we also didn't find another organization doing work like this. But we did learn something that was pretty interesting. And that was that we couldn't find another country where the climate movement was leaving so many votes on the table. There was no other country where we could find this potential power that wasn't being realized. Now, for a whole bunch of reasons, it's hard to run experiments comparing one country to another because every country has a different political system. But my guess is, and I think a lot of other sort of smart people who do comparative political analysis think this as well, is that in parliamentary systems or in systems where it's not always first past the post voting, there is a lot more engagement up and down the ballot around climate politics and environmental politics, because it's not just a binary choice between two political parties. And you have not just two political parties up and down the ballot, but you also have a lot of environmental groups running locally, even if they're not running nationally. And that has the benefit of engaging a different type of voter. And we don't have that in the United States.
You kind of reminded me again in the community that live in Canada when I'm not in California, is that we had the wholesale change of the mayor and city council in the last election. Just a group of local citizens got together and said, we're going to form a party that is going to challenge these guys because we think growth is out of hand, right? And they won. They literally swept the entire council mayor. Now, I have to be honest, they haven't lived up to all their promises, but let's see what happens. Back to the previous conversation. Nathaniel, one of the things that's different in the United States is that the environment got caught up in the left-right divide in a way that is profoundly impactful in my mind. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act were actually had as many Republicans supporting, and some Republicans would claim they were actually Republican initiatives, not even Democratic initiatives. They happened under Republican presidents without big majorities of Democrats. But now the environment, not just climate change, the environment has become like a left-right divide. We can't solve that here in this room, but it vexes me about how to somehow begin to disconnect those two, because I think there are even a lot of folks in the middle who are environmental who have now, but somehow this issue has become a Republican Democrat issue. And part of that is the two-party system. So everything has to become one or the other, right? You almost every issue now, it's like, as you said, it's binary, whereas in some other countries, it's not. And if you have any thoughts on that, I'd love it. We won't solve it, but to me, it's a big issue in the environmental movement generally.
So I think you're right. But I don't want to overstate it, because even though people who care deeply about climate and the environment are disproportionately Democrats in the United States, what that does not mean is that there aren't lots of Republicans who, even though it's not a top priority, they still care about it. Moreover, if you look at, there isn't lots of polling data that tests what I'm about to say, but there is some. You'll see that being a pro-climate or pro-environment Republican doesn't hurt their electoral chances. Now, it hurts it in some primaries because of fossil fuel money, but it doesn't get voters to dislike them. There's no downside with voters if you are a pro-clean energy Republican or things like that. But to get to my second point, and I think this is so important to understand, there is a downside with donors. And I think you appropriately went and looked back at the 70s and 80s, because it is important to think about sort of the genesis of the environmental movement in the late 60s and early 70s, and that how that grew into Nixon era legislation and things like that. But if I were to point to a second most important moment in political time for the climate movement, I would point to the Citizens United decision. You talk to any United States senator right now, and if you get them in private, they will admit that there are probably 10 or 15 Republican U.S. senators who are closeted climate leaders. They aren't climate deniers. They understand physics. They understand science. They just can't lead on climate anymore, because since the Citizens United decision, fossil fuel companies can now spend an absurd amount of money, especially in primaries, which means it's political suicide for Republicans to be climate leaders. Now, we can be frustrated by that. I certainly am. But we can also recognize that what that means is this is not some like deeply felt divide in American society. No, this isn't like abortion or other issues. It isn't like all of these Republicans woke up in like 2012 and all of a sudden forgot how physics works. No, they're just trying to win elections. And so I choose to look at that and view the positive side of that, which is that we actually don't need to change a lot of conservative leaders' minds. We just need to make it easier for them to win elections while being climate leaders. Because many of them are already there. Many of them are already there. Just they choose, I won't even call it climate deniers. I'll say they choose to be climate liars because it's easier for them to win elections that way. And so it's incumbent upon us in the climate movement to change that around. We need to make it easier for people to win elections while leading on climate. And to be clear, that doesn't just go for Republicans. It goes for Democrats too. There are a lot of Democrats who ain't as good when it comes to leading on climate as they could be. And it's incumbent upon us to hold their feet to the fire.
I was thinking, hopefully, Nathaniel, someone is listening today and thinking, now that would be great to start an organization for that mission, right? Because I think you make a really important point about, if 78% of Americans believe that climate change is happening, and 53% say it's man-made, but that's a soft number in my mind, right? That's in a way the politicians are shaping that because of the money, right? And so I love what you said. It's a hopeful statement, and maybe that's something even individually we can take on. Almost every one of our listeners probably has friends who vote differently than they do. And again, we're not partisan, but having those kind of conversations with those voters who you're good friends with, who have a different view maybe on some issues like you said, tax or fiscal things or a trade, that you can encourage them to be in a different place. But money, we could have a whole podcast, and we should, on money and politics, of course.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
don't let the money frustrate you. I mean, at the end of the day, what is political money good for? Getting you more votes. Like, it all comes down to votes. And I feel like many of your listeners, and certainly, you and me and many of our friends, we all probably would say something like, gosh, those politicians, they will do whatever it takes to win an election. And I'd like to suggest to you, take your cynicism one step further. If you think politicians would do whatever it takes to win an election, that actually doesn't mean that you are powerless. That actually doesn't mean that your vote doesn't matter. In fact, what that means is that your vote is the only thing that matters. All politicians care about is getting enough votes to remain a politician. And so what that means is you need to get more politically engaged, because their decisions when it comes to climate policy making probably aren't going to be informed by the physicists as much as they're going to be informed by the polls of likely voters. So you better get your butts out the door and vote whenever there's an election, because that's what politicians pay attention to.
You've described very well what you do as an organization. So what can the average person listening to this podcast do to get more environmental voters to get out and vote intelligently from an environmental perspective? So
great question. So first, go to environmentalvoter.org. Okay. Mm-hmm. We make it so easy for you to volunteer. You can sign up online. You can do door-to-door canvassing. You can write postcards. You can call these non-voting environmentalists. We don't endorse candidates. It's completely nonpartisan. But what we do is we give you proven messaging that we know from our randomized control trials increases turnout among non-voting environmentalists. So that's the first thing you can do. Go to environmentalvoter.org and volunteer your time. Second, never miss an election. Vote, vote, vote. Whether you vote or not is public record, and so politicians pay attention, and you got to make sure you're showing up to vote. The final thing I'll say is this: be loud and proud about being an environmental voter. Take it from someone who studies the behavioral science of voting every single day. The most power you have as an individual is your social ability to influence your peers and your friends.
Right.
Whether they know it or not, they are always looking to you for cues as to the appropriate way to behave. Maybe they're looking to you to see what's the best way to be a parent or a friend or a neighbor or an environmentalist. But we're a social species, and we're always looking around to figure out what's the right thing to do in this situation. And you need to use that power to make sure that all of your friends and peers know that being a voter is a crucially important part of being an environmentalist and being a good citizen and being a good neighbor. That is an enormously powerful thing that you can do, whether you're on social media or just talking to people on the street. Let them know that you're a voter. That will absolutely make a difference.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And it should be said, probably a good time to mention this, that our co-sponsors for this podcast, the Elders Climate Action and the Elders Action Network, have partnered with Nathaniel's organization and in a very active way. And a lot of those folks are sending those postcards and engaging. So I want to double down on that. And you can do that either through Nathaniel's organization or through Elders Climate Action. But yeah, doubling down on getting involved. Some really practical, easy things that you can, not easy things, important things you can do, but easy in the sense of not going to take a lot from you, but could have a big impact.
That's exactly right. And let's face it, we all know that we're dealing with some pretty scary problems these days, politically speaking, not to mention the climate crisis. These are just some enormous things that weigh on us. And I'm not just saying this as someone who runs a nonprofit that works with a lot of volunteers. It's so valuable just from a mental health perspective to be able to do things and feel like you're making a difference. So even if you don't volunteer with Elders Climate Action or with the Environmental Voter Project, I encourage you to find a way to get politically involved or get involved with a climate group near you, not just because of the impact you can make on society, but because of the impact you can make on yourself. Oh my gosh, is it a balm for the soul to be able to just stop worrying for a few hours and know that you're making a difference?
Yeah, just to reinforce what you said, Nathaniel, a big amen to that. Fascinating research I talked about in my book, Stepping Up, about social media and happiness. And it turns out people are on social media mostly as passive recipients, watching other people's A rolls while you're living the C roll of your life, ranting, oh, that's so horrible, that's going on, are less happy, in fact. But people who are on social media are engaged, connecting with other people, supporting issues they care about, promoting ideas that they care about. They're actually happier than people who aren't on social media. So in all of our lives, acting with agency, doing something is a great elixir for sadness, not just in our lives, but in our political lives as well. It's so important. Now, there's two demographics I want to kind of get you to talk about, Nathaniel: the old and the young. Bill McKibben, who started 360.org and who was on our podcast, has a great line. He said, "Nothing has been invented yet to keep an older person from voting." So we know that older voters are most likely to vote. I could jokingly say we need a voter suppression movement for older voters, maybe, but just kidding. I'm one of them. So don't do it. But talk about the young voters for a moment, because obviously this is a vexing issue, because young voters undoubtedly are disproportionately more environmentally conscious. I know that from my own two millennial daughters, and I spend a lot of time with young people at universities. What have you discovered around younger voters in particular? Again, this is not just a problem for environmental voting, but period. But any thoughts in particular about younger voters and how we can maybe crack the code there?
Absolutely. So first, you don't want to fall into the trap of trying to rationally convince them of the value of their vote. In fact, I would say that goes for anybody. And I know we're all children of the Enlightenment, and we like to think that rational discourse is the only way to get people to do things. But no, think of it more like a beer commercial, right? Like if you see a beer commercial, are they going to tell you like how much the bottle of beer costs and what the ingredients are? No, they're going to say, you want to be like this person? Well, buy this product. And I know that sounds glib, but come on, even Aristotle said like man is the social animal. We are almost pathologically social, and we're all looking around to figure out the ways that we can interact with each other in the world. And that absolutely goes for young people too. And don't take me the wrong way. I'm not saying that young people aren't open to being rationally convinced to do things. No, I'm saying that no human beings are. And if we want to change people's behavior, we need to figure out who does your target audience want to be? And perhaps even more important, how do they want to be viewed? How are they trying to be seen in the world? What kind of person are they trying to be? Mm-hmm. I would suggest that isn't a shallow analysis of who they are. That's actually a very deep analysis of who they are. And if you're interacting with young people, it's really important to understand, what are they trying to be in the world? What values are they trying to project to their peers? Oftentimes, if you can figure that out and you can align the act of voting with that, that's where you get the best results. Just like to take something in a completely different context, let's take the public health context. Just like when COVID first hit, some of the most successful public health campaigns were not campaigns that essentially said, like, if you don't want to die, maybe you should get this shot. Whereas you'd think that would make like pretty good logical sense. Instead, they were trying to take advantage of, what are some social norms that people buy into? Do they want to be thought of as a good father? Well, let's equate the act of getting vaccinated with being a good father. Do they want to be thought of as a good patriot? Well, then let's equate the act of voting with being patriotic. Same thing goes for young people. If they are trying to be thought of as a generational leader, well, let's equate the act of voting with that. If they're trying to be thought of as a rebel, let's equate the act of voting with a form of rebellion. Things like that. This is why a lot of Bernie Sanders's rhetoric juiced turnout. It wasn't because people were like making a cost benefit analysis thinking like, well, you know, if I vote, the following things could happen and Bernie Sanders might win. Most of Bernie Sanders supporters didn't think he was going to win, yet he still boosted turnout because they weren't thinking of it as like a cost benefit analysis, that their one vote might make a difference. No, it aligned with how they wanted to be viewed in the world. And I think that's such an important way for us to approach engaging any large community.
So we are coming to the end of our time together. And I have one last question for you, which we asked from most of our guests. In which way do you attempt to be regenerative in your life?
I try to, and I'm not always good at this, but I try to be as unselfish as possible with my children and my wife. You know, when you live with people every day, it's so easy to think about how they're inconveniencing you. Like, why can't they just live the way I want them to live, right? Right. But instead, I try to think each day when I'm at my best, and I'm not always at my best, how can I make them a little bit stronger and a little bit happier and a little bit healthier? How can I use my place in their lives, not to make things harder for them and make them aware of my needs, but instead try to make them a little bit healthier by thinking of their needs? And I don't want to pretend it's easy. It's not. It's hard to live with people, even people you really, really love. But when I'm at my most mindful, and when I like to think that I'm at my best, I am figuring out ways to lift them up and hopefully be regenerative in sort of a holistic sense, where I'm sort of bringing more strength to the whole. I can't always live up to that, but boy, is it always a goal of mine.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, Nathaniel, first of all, thank you for being here today. More importantly, thank you for having the vision to start the Environmental Voter Project. And please check it out. Go to their site. You'll see the links there. And again, if you're involved in the Elders Climate Action, Elders Action Network, you can also get involved in that through them. So again, thank you, Nathaniel, for the good work you're doing and for the great conversation today. A lot of other things we could have covered, but really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you, Ella. And maybe we can cover it next time. I'd love to continue the conversation.
We'd love to have you back. So, Alon, as I think about our conversation today, a couple of things really stand out for me. Just going back to that New York Times article, elections are won when 1/3 of the people don't vote. Elections are mostly determined by who comes out to vote. And that's probably as true in local elections as it is in national elections. And so anything that we can do with our money, with our time, with our voice, that will encourage people to get out and vote. The second thing is double down on Nathaniel's point about it's not about getting people to rationally decide to vote. The research has been done, for example, if you tell people are apathetic and they're not getting involved, so you should get involved, people are less likely to get involved because now you've normalized. So that's what the crowd is doing. So I guess I won't, but if you say, and Nathaniel gave an example, record numbers of people are getting their voice heard, getting involved, getting out and voting. That matters. And I love what Nathaniel said about be a proud environmental voter. And I think so many of us, especially in a nation that's so divided, are sometimes reticent to proudly be an environmental voter. But I think it's really important for each of our listeners who are in that category to be a proud environmental voter. And I think I want to piggyback it to something that Nathaniel said, that there are many people who you think disagree with you on a lot of issues, who probably agree with you about the environment. And don't be a proud environmental voter ranting about all those people who are against you. Just be a proud environmental voter, both in person and in social media, with the people that you know, especially those who might not be likely to vote those convictions because they're likely with you. And I think one of the points I took from Nathaniel's conversation, it's a hopeful point, is I think we can find a time with moderates in America and in politics we'll be able to be pro-environmental again and disconnected from these other more fiery issues that people care about. So, Alon, anything you want to say, and then I'll close this out?
No, this was a very good conversation. I thank you, Nathaniel, for making it so clear what we can do, what each of us can do.
So finally, I want to thank you, our listeners. You're why we're here. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe and let others know. If you like what you heard, but think we could do better and other guests or topics we could have, we'd love to hear from you. And we'll close the way we always close on this podcast, especially given the topic today. Remember that history is not a future time waiting for us to arrive. What we will someday call history is determined by what you and I and we do collectively today. And someday they'll call that history. So thanks again. We'll see you next time on The Way Forward.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast. You have many choices, and we appreciate your interest and support. We want to hear from you. Please reach out to us at thewayforwardrc@gmail.com with your thoughts and feedback. Your input helps us create a podcast that you want to listen to and share with your friends. If you have guest recommendations, we would love to hear those as well. A special thank you to our sponsors, Elders Climate Action and Elders Action Network, who are building a movement of elders to address the environmental, governance, and social issues of our time. You can learn more about their work at eldersaction.org and eldersclimateaction.org. Until next time, I'm Jim Burke, and this is the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast. You can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, and Amazon Music. You can watch us on YouTube. In parting, may I wish you a regenerative present and future.